Hello everyone, hope you all are doing well. So we are back with a summary of chapter number 14 and chapter number 15 of Why Nations Fail. Chapter number 14 is named as Breaking the Mold. It is based on the three stories. One is of three African chiefs, the other is the end of southern extraction, and the third is about rebirth in China. It is a very interesting chapter. So let's start with section number 1. It is about the three African chiefs. It is based on Botswana. In 1895, three Swana chiefs who were mainly the Botswana's chief. They were from the South Africa. They visited England. The imperialist businessman Cecil Rhodes was trying to take over the Swana land, but on their trip the Swana chief successfully convinced the British government to do it first so that Rhodes couldn't. Basically, these three African chiefs saved the Botswana island or the Botswana land from that imperialist businessman Cecil Rhodes. And the author explained that the three Swana chiefs managed to coordinate and petition the British government only because the Botswana state have a history of centralized and pluralistic institutions. And the author says in Botswana state, before it was a Botswana, it was the Swana state, there was a tribal assembly of adult men, and even the common man and the layman had the right to disagree with the tribal chief. And there were a system of democracy, and there were a system of pluralistic form of way of doing things. That is why when the three chiefs went to London, they had the people's support, and that is why the Swana's chief tried to stay independent from the British, and they wanted their own land. That is why the institutions of Botswana aren't extractive and they are centralized and inclusive. That is why in 1966, when Botswana was extremely poor, it had virtually no infrastructure or education system, and its neighbors were all white apartheid regimes. But it grew extremely fast, and now it is the wealthiest sub-Saharan African country. And the author says it succeeded by building inclusive institutions. Politically, Botswana is a democracy with regular elections and no armed clique. And economically, its laws protect property rights and encourage innovation and investment. So this is the case of Botswana. And the author says at the critical juncture of its independence, Botswana harnessed its history of centralization and pluralism. That is why it became a prosperous country. And the next section, which is the end of the southern extraction, it is based on the US. It starts with the Rosa Parks, and when Rosa Parks launched the Montgomery boycott in 1955, the author explained how the civil rights movement just started with Rosa Parks rebelling and protesting against the Jim Crow's law, and it just ended the vicious circle of extractive institutions, which kept it much poorer than other parts of the country. And the cycle broke because segregation's black victims started organizing for political change, while key national institutions took their side. And when black workers started migrating to industrialized northern cities, the southern elites started to lose their power. And that is how the vicious circle ended. The next section is about China, the rebirth in China. In this section, the authors have explained how in 1949 the Chinese Communist Party took power and it just built the extractive institutions. Chairman Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, and he tried to industrialize China all at once, but it wasn't reasonable. That is why tens of millions of people died in a famine, and then his regime prosecuted and killed its enemies during the Cultural Revolution. But after Mao Zedong's death, the Communist Party fought for control. So there were two main factions. One was the left-wing Gang of Four, and the other was moderates like the Deng Xiaoping party. He opposed the Cultural Revolution and hoped to spur the economic growth through inclusive institutions. So that is why the acting premier of that time, whose name was Hua Guofeng, he sided with Deng Xiaoping, and they arrested the Gang of Four. After that, Deng Xiaoping gradually directed the government towards economic modernization project and away from the Cultural Revolution. After that, Deng Xiaoping just ousted the Hua and replaced most of the party leadership. After securing political control, Deng Xiaoping government passed economic reforms. They gave incentives for productivity in agriculture and industry, and they embraced the foreign investment. While China's political institutions remain extractive, its economic institutions became inclusive. That is why China became so prosperous, and its economic institutions have become so inclusive that they are enough to generate explosive growth for several decades. So the authors suggest that Botswana the US South and China, as well as the Glorious Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Meiji Restoration in Japan, it proves that history is not destiny. It is possible to escape the vicious circle of extractive institutions. It is just very difficult, not impossible. Apart from luck, it requires a broad political coalition to push for reform during a critical juncture. That is why the countries who have adopted a right path at the critical juncture are now far more richer and far more prosperous than the other countries. So up till now we have discussed so many cases like that, but the main cases that are worth to be noted are the from this chapter are the Botswana, the US South, and the China. And then we have discussed the case of Glorious Revolution, the French Revolution, and Meiji Restoration in the previous chapters. So this is how the chapter 14 ends, and now we will move on to our last chapter, which is chapter number 15. Chapter number 15 is titled as Understanding Prosperity and Poverty. In this section, we are going to discuss the historical origins, the irresistible charm of authoritarian growth, you can't engineer prosperity, the failure of foreign aid, and empowerment. Just keep in mind that this is the last chapter of the book, so that in this chapter, in every section of this chapter, the author has tried to summarize their argument, so it might be a bit long. So the first section is the historical origin. In this section, the authors have explained that global living standards have become deeply unequal since the 19th century, and they say this isn't because of geography, culture, or ethnicity, because if it was because of geography, culture, or ethnicity, it might be inevitable. The author explained that this book is their attempt to explain this divergence. Unlike most social scientists, they deliberately choose a simple explanation based on a single factor. While their theory isn't perfect, it does explain the inner working of successful and failed state. They say it does in two ways. First, through the concept of inclusive and extractive institution, and second is by explaining why people created inclusive institution in certain times and place. They say inclusive economic institution create economic prosperity by securing property rights, promoting innovation, and making the economy fairer. They say that inclusive political institutions reinforce these inclusive economic institutions through pluralism and state centralization. And they say that economic institutions can generate economic growth, but extractive institutions' growth isn't sustainable. First, the real growth depends on innovation and creative destruction, which the elites resist. And second, under extractive institutions, the powerful inevitably became wealthy, so the elite tends to fight for power. This creates political instability and undermines growth. So the author says that extractive political and economic institutions reinforce each other in a vicious cycle, while the inclusive institutions and the inclusive economic and political institutions do the same thing in a virtuous circle. So these circles are strong but not breakable. So if someone wants to break the cycle, they can. And then the author says that institutions generally transform around the critical junctures, but it depends on the nations that how they are going to adopt this critical juncture. And then they say that institutions become different in the first place due to the institutional drift or a long series of contingent unpredictable changes that give certain groups more institutional powers than the other. And they quoted the small differences between the English, Spanish, and the French monarchies in the 16th century, and they showed how 16th century small differences allowed England to gain much more from the transatlantic trade. Then they say that history is the key to institutional success or failure, but the history is not predetermined. They say that Peru wasn't destined to end up poorer than the US and the Western Europe. Instead, it is poorer because of its European colonialism, which created the inclusive institution in the US and Western Europe, but created the extractive institutions in Peru. The authors have admitted that because their theory depends on historical contingency and small institutional differences, it can't predict the future. But they also say that no theory can predict the future because history is never predetermined. And the author says that their theory can broadly explain global inequality, so it can also generally indicate which society will grow in future. The author argued that US and Western Europe will stay much richer than the rest of the world, and although some poorer country will surely become rich by breaking the mold. For example, they say that highly decentralized countries like Afghanistan, Haiti, and Somalia are unlikely to grow, but highly centralized poor countries like Rwanda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, Brazil, and Mexico will likely likely achieve some growth under their extractive institutions. Then they say that this kind of growth is not sustainable because they say that countries like China will probably run out of steam because but much of the future is contingent. For example, Cuba, North Korea and Myanmar could become more inclusive, or they could stay highly extractive and absolutist. Then the authors also warn that the leaders shouldn't try to look for the policy recommendations in their book. The same policy can have opposite effect in different parts of the world depending on their institutions. Moreover, they say that there is no easy formula for turning extractive institutions into inclusive one, and if someone try to do this, it can backfire because of the vicious circle. And then they say that this book can help leaders identify bad policies that won't work because they are based on a misunderstanding of how institutions function. In the next section, which is the irresistible charm of authoritarian growth, the authors have presented the case of a Chinese style growth under extractive institutions. They explain how a businessman whose name was Tai Kuo-fang, he started a steel company and it was arrested because the company would compete with state-owned businesses. The author says that the Chinese Communist Party has allowed the economy to expand, but it still maintains the rigid control over, and it prefers to reserve all major projects for the state-owned enterprises. And then the author says that Chinese economic institutions have become much more inclusive, but they are still extractive and there is little innovation in China. And the authors argued that China's technology boom is based on copying existing technologies, not creating the new ones, and property rights are still insecure, so the party can take away entrepreneurs' businesses at any time. But by aligning themselves with the party, businesses receive significant advantage like exemption from regulation. And the author also says the China's economy has grown, its political institutions have actually become less inclusive and pluralistic and democratic. And then the author says that many countries are trying to develop through the Chinese style authoritarian growth instead of opening up markets and trade, but the authors think leaders really choose this path to increase their own power. But it might lead to growth in short term, and the authoritarian growth can't create sustainable growth in the long term. That is why the authors predict that China's growth will end once it reaches middle income living standards, especially if the Communist Party stayed in power, and it could also switch to more inclusive institutions and continue growing, but this seems unlikely. So this is basically the author's prediction. And the next section, which is you can't engineer prosperity. In this section, the authors critique the idea that smart policy changes can fix poverty without accompanying institutional changes. So the author just denied this thing. They say, for example, the IMF often pressure developing countries to adopt liberal economic policies, but institutions and leaders in those countries can subvert the policy's intent. For example, the IMF convinced the Zimbabwe and Sierra Leone to make their central bank legally independent, but the national leaders still control them. So the author just disagree with the IMF policies, and they say that this is a bad idea that smart policy changes can fix poverty. They say it couldn't because such nations require a complete institutional change. So in the next section, which is the failure of foreign aid, the authors look at the case of how after the US invasion of Afghanistan, NGOs and foreign governments pumped billions of aid dollars into the country. First of all, this money went to the UN officials, plane ticket and translators. Next, and the NGOs took lots of money for themselves, and one village was promised millions of dollars but merely received a few useless wooden beams. In fact, 80 to 90% of the foreign aid money usually goes to overhead costs, corruption and extractive government. So the US has tried to make foreign aid conditional on institutional reform in the receiving country, but the authors argued that no amount of money and aid will make dictators give up the attractive institutions that enrich themselves. The authors don't argue that Western countries should eliminate foreign aid. Instead, they suggest that policymakers shouldn't expect foreign aid to spur growth and should direct it to programs that make institutions more inclusive. Finally, under the last heading, which is the empowerment, the author described how the metal worker and union activist whose name was Lula, he led a wave of strikes across the Brazil in 1978. The next year, he helped found the Workers' Party, which represented a broad coalition of unions. The Workers' Party grew, and then they fought the military dictatorship by integrating the local activists. Eventually, in 2002, that activist Lula won the presidency. The Workers' Party succeeded because it brought different groups together into a broad coalition, and during its rule, it significantly reduced poverty and inequality. And in the 1970s, Brazil overcame dictatorship and built inclusive institutions through broad coalition. While revolution built inclusive institutions in England, France, and Japan, they also created cruel extractive institutions in Russia, Cuba, and China. So the author says the first three revolutions, that is the England Glorious Revolution, the French Revolution, and Japan's Meiji Restoration, these three revolutions succeeded because broad empowered coalition led them. And the last three, which is the Russian Revolution, the Cuban Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution, these three revolutions failed because narrow elites led them. Similarly, in the 1970s, the Worker Party didn't just take power across Brazil, it also transformed government by empowering ordinary citizens. But this didn't happen in other countries like Venezuela, where democracy created a corrupt elite rather than a broad coalition. So the author concluded their book, and they admit that there is no formula for empowering citizens or creating inclusive institutions. And they say centralization, existing pluralistic institutions, and community organization can all help empower people. And they say that media can help citizens coordinate and demand. For example, the pamphlets helped the Glorious Revolution and also the French Revolution. But they say in the present area, this thing is being done with the social media and the internet. But the authoritarians try to control the media, and they presented the example of President Alberto. He bribed the TV station and newspaper for positive coverage, and then the Chinese Communist Party also tries to tightly control the media today. That is why, unfortunately, the media can only help create inclusive institutions when citizens are already pushing for them, and there is no shortest recipe for inclusive institutions. The author have presented many of the recommendations, and if these recommendations are heartily followed, it can lead to a prosperous nation. And it have mainly discussed the case of each and every country of the world. So this is how the chapter number 15 ends. So we'll end our video and our book at this point. If you have liked our video and all the series, then do let us know. If you think it is a very long series, then I have another alternative for you. I'm going to upload a short video that might be of half an hour long of all the 15 chapters, and in that video I'll just discuss the main sections. I will not go deeper into the details of that sections, but each chapter with its 5 sections, I'll just tell 1 to 2 examples from each chapter. So if you want that thing, you can go and watch that video. So we'll end our video at this point. Stay tuned. Allah Hafiz.